This is sort of a response video to something that I did a few weeks ago, and I noticed a lot of people made a number of people made some rather negative comments and under the video and some email to me. I did a video about my ivory carvings and collection and the rhino horn that's in my care right now, and a bit about a carved tortoiseshell. In following that video, I had a number of posts. So some of you have probably seen it underneath it, where someone suggested that I should perhaps go on an unguided safari in Africa, where nature could right the wrongs of the past by somehow taking it out on me, because I appreciate elephant ivory carvings. I'm somehow an evil person, some of those comments, that comment actually paled in comparison to a few that I got in my email. I got about a dozen and a half in my email from people who were outraged that I was talking about carved ivory and carved rhino horn and so forth in such positive terms. Not that I was advocating for the return of elephant poaching or rhino hunting. I'm not. That wasn't the point. The point was to be able to look at the item that was produced in a time period that all of this was completely acceptable and normal, and view it in its context and enjoy it for what it is and what it represents. All right. And this is something that seems increasingly difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around today. And I don't know why. The CITES, the Conservation Act known as CITES, and the Endangered Elephant Conservation Act of 1989 went in on the same year and basically banned all ivory trade in and out of the United States. The problem with the law was that it banned antique ivory as well as modern ivory, because the argument at the time was that if you're collecting antique ivory, you're driving demand for ivory products. And since that was said and used as an excuse to push the law through, it's been proved to be completely untrue and extremely inaccurate. And the reason they know is because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, when I was asked to come in, and I was asked on 4 occasions to speak before the Massachusetts House and the Massachusetts Senate, two with the House, 2 with the Senate, and on this topic as an advocate for the antique industry. And one of the things that came up is part of those hearings were that the Fish and Wildlife Department had to admit that since 1989, of all the ivory interdicted during that time, it amounted to just about half of one day's worth of poaching after 26 years of interdiction and strict law enforcement. That's all they found. And the types of ivory interdicted were pretty evenly split between antique ivory that was brought back by people who had gone to Asia and to Africa, and modern ivory that was being sold in Hong Kong and sold in Africa and other places. But it was fairly well split down the middle, and it represented basically for that time period, I believe it was 6/100ths of a percent of the total ivory taken, and that was it. All right, and then finally the whole thing petered out, and the push for increased enforcement was dropped because it was found to be fairly meaningless. Didn't do anything. So the question is, why that? And anybody that's followed this topic is aware of all this, and they're aware that they didn't push through a whole slew of new laws. So why the negative comments if you know what you're talking about? Why is there a ban on the sale and so forth of antique ivory, antique rhino horns, if it has no impact on creating demand for new carvings? That was the point of making the antiques illegal, was that the argument was that it would cause a surge in interest in collecting, and that simply wasn't the case, because ivory carving was completely legal in China up until about, 5 years ago. You could still go into shops on Hollywood Road and buy carved ivory. You could go into the mainland and buy it. And the people that were buying that were not antique collectors. They were new carving buyers. That's what they were for. That's what they were going there for. All right. And why? Well, it's pretty simple why. This movement against it, because of the anger over past killings of elephants, is led by a bunch of idiots and delusional thinking individuals who are frankly just complaining entertaining busybodies, I have to say. I don't know how else to say it. And these objects and their collectors in many places are condemned. The collectors are met with derision by a cadre of sort of shallow-minded, ill-informed social justice warrior types who don't understand the art, they don't understand the history, they don't understand the wide acceptance of it, and so forth. It's pretty sad. And shamelessly, our politicians tend to go along with it because they don't want to hit re-election issues. They want to raise money from these groups because they do, animal rights groups and whatnot, donate lots and lots of money to the right politicians. And I saw it firsthand when I was doing the testimony a number of years ago. I spoke to the attorney for the Massachusetts Senate, and he said this is basically a dog and pony show. We've already seen the numbers. These new laws aren't going anywhere. We're going to shelve them and let them die in committee, and that's the end of it. But they had to go along with it. All right. And the reason is they have all these activists out there who are sort of a bunch of numbskulls, and they've got a bunch of sheep following along behind them that will complain and have a grievance about almost anything if you put it to them in the right way, that want to ban antique, artistically made ivory products, rhino horns, you name it. And it turned into a mess, and these poor legislators had to quietly tiptoe away from it because they knew it wasn't going to do anything. It was going to be a waste of time, and it was just a new layer of regulation on top of bad regulation that already exists. All right, and this is a very dangerous situation because when you allow for the filter of modernity to pass judgment on a previous art form, something that was completely accepted, something that was not unusual, something that was not sneaking around. This ivory wasn't gained illegally or any of that. The rhinoceros horns were not gained illegally. The moral question, that's up to today to think about. But at the time, if you're a fan of history, at the time, if you put yourself in the position of the people then, what would you have thought? You wouldn't have thought anything of it. You would have said, oh, so-and-so shot an elephant. Oh, so-and-so bought a rhinoceros horn back from China. And it would have been a point of fascination and appreciation, not a point of horror and derision. And this is the major difference between then and today. And the problem is that once you open the door to banning certain forms of art, based on their material content, you're a pretty short hop away from banning art of different types based on the art itself, what it says, what it represents, and so forth. And this is a problem that we've seen in this country in recent years. We've seen it with controversial modern artists. We've seen it happen, and it shouldn't have been done. We've seen it with just a few years ago when they were tearing down statues all over the country of historic figures and people from their creation in the United States. It even got as far as there was serious discussions of removing imagery of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, two of the most influential figures of world history, removing their images from public places and so forth because they owned slaves. Well, everybody owned slaves back then. It was common. And this inability to recognize history through the eyes of the people that lived at the time is the problem. If you lived in late 18th century America, the chances are you would have been indifferent or fine with the idea of slavery because most people were. All right. Just like today, just like back then, most people were fine with elephant hunting. Most people were fine with all kinds of things today that we find inappropriate and abhorrent and aren't going to happen. But back then, what was common practice has to be viewed as common practice. And then you're free to observe it for however you wish. But to condemn it and remove it from public view is just frankly destructive. All right, and going ahead, what are you going to do? Okay, you banned ivory. Is it going to undo the massive amounts of Arab and Swahili trade of caravans that were responsible for about 90% of all the ivory that ever left Africa? Along with often these caravans also had spices and gold and of course slavery and all that. Are you going to undo any of that by walking away from it? No, you're not. You're not going to undo it. There's nothing to undo. You either can appreciate it and look at it and learn from it through the historic lens, or you can just ban it. All right. And banning it is not the way to go, in my opinion. All right. The reality is condemning any kind of art and removing it from the market, because the today's world, here we are 500 years later after it's created, or 100 years after, is a dangerous door. It's a dangerous door to open. You have to think about this very, very seriously. What about James Audubon? He killed tens of thousands of birds in order to paint and study them, to produce his great book, the Audubon Society, which is the greatest, most famous bird watching organization in the world. Are we going to rename it? Some people have suggested it. Some people have said take his name off because he murdered all these birds. Yeah, he did. That was normal. That was normal. That's what people did. All right. You have founders of universities who were slave traders. You have Winston Churchill, who was involved with the famine in India. You're going to remove images of him, bronzes of him. Che Guevara, the man was a rapist, a murderer, and a communist. Is he going to be outlawed? Is imagery outlawed? Chairman Mao, you name it. Orientalist slave paintings. What about Christian art? What about some of the horrific stuff that has come out of different religions? Are you going to ban the religious art? The Massacre of the Innocents by Paul Rubens. Russian Revolution art. Brushpots made of zittan wood, which are now endangered. All right. Where does it stop? And this is the problem. This is the problem. And if said yes to any of the above, as far as being willing to see them get banned, you're not a fan of human history. You're not curious. You just want to somehow think you have the power to pass judgment, or the right to pass judgment over previous generations. You can have your thoughts about them, but you weren't in the period. You weren't there, as they say. So how could you possibly know? How could you possibly know? And eventually, this ship that seems to be coming out of its era of mass overcorrection from a few years ago is now coming back to center. I noticed increasingly in the last few years that ivory and rhino horns are being sold once again openly in Europe, in France, in England at auction. All right. They have restrictions on what you can do with them after the sale, because you can't get them out necessarily, out of the EU. If you buy something in France, you can't take it out of the EU, but you can take it to Italy. You can take it to Switzerland. You can take it to Austria. And I think it's because they're taking a little more mature view of it. And they've recognized the same thing that we recognized here, that the people dealing with and dabbling in modern ivory are not the same people who collect and buy and appreciate antique ivory, antique rhino horns, antique whatever things are made from. They recognize that there's a difference. And I'm hoping that eventually some adults will come back into the room here in the United States and soften that silly law up and say, yeah, if it's obviously antique, obviously made prior to 1980, yes, of course you can sell it. Of course you can. It wasn't produced illegally, and that's all there is to it. All right. So let's see if this happens. I don't know if it will, but those are my thoughts on it. And if you have something to say on the subject, I'd be happy to hear it. But keep it civil and keep it polite. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll be back later this week with another video, but this is something I felt I needed to say. Okay. Bye-bye.